This is the story of the most technically advanced skateboarder alive in 1990 and why almost nobody saw him step up to a judge contest for most of the decade that followed. By 1990, Rodney Mullen had won 33 of the 35 freestyle contests he had entered over the previous 10 years, the single most dominant run in the history of skateboard competition. Freestyle was built around flat ground tricks, spins, and technical footwork rather than ramps or rails, and Mullen had spent his entire childhood inventing much of the vocabulary that skateboarding still runs on today. The flat ground ollie, the kickflip, the heel flip, moves so foundational that most people who do them now have no idea they came from one specific person figuring them out alone in a driveway. By any reasonable measure, he was the best in the world at what he did. And by the time the 1990s actually began, the format he had mastered no longer had anywhere left to compete in. Part of the answer sits inside his own home, not inside the sport. Mullen has written and spoken extensively about growing up under a father who viewed skateboarding as an embarrassment and a waste, and who exercised total control over whether Rodney was allowed to touch a board at all. At more than one point, his father forbade him from skating entirely, a punishment Mullen has since connected directly to real depression, describing a version of himself that stopped eating properly and could not sleep through the night. When his father eventually allowed him back on a board, Mullen has said his appetite and his sleep both returned almost immediately, as if the ban itself had been the actual illness. He documented this relationship in detail years later in his memoir, The Mutt. How to Skateboard and Not Kill Yourself, co-written with Sean Mortimer, a title that makes no attempt to soften how closely skating and survival were tied together in his mind. Mullen has described his father as someone who treated ordinary teenage independence as a threat to be managed, and skateboarding specifically as proof of a rebellious streak that needed correcting. The bans were not abstract. They were direct, repeated removals of the one outlet Mullen had built his entire sense of self around, and the psychological toll he has described reads less like ordinary teenage moodiness and more like a young world champion being systematically cut off from the only thing that made him feel like himself. Think about what that means for a teenager who was simultaneously the most dominant competitor in his discipline's history. Mullen was not just managing the ordinary pressure of competition. He was managing a home environment where the thing he was best at in the entire world was treated as a source of shame, sometimes taken away entirely as punishment. That instability alone would have made a smooth transition into any new phase of his career difficult. But the sport itself pulled the ground away a second time, and this part had nothing to do with his father at all. By the start of the 90s, freestyle skateboarding was DIYing as a competitive category. Vert ramps and street skating were taking over public attention, sponsorship money, and magazine coverage, and freestyle contests simply stopped drawing crowds or press. It did not matter that Mullen held the best record in the format's history. The format itself was disappearing underneath him. There was, quite literally, less and less left to compete in, no matter how good he was at it. None of this happened while Mullen was sitting on the sidelines of the industry either. Back in 1987, years before any of this unfolded, he had co-founded World Industries alongside Steve Rocco, becoming a business owner inside skateboarding while he was still a teenager competing in freestyle. That detail complicates the simple idea that Mullen spent the 90s invisible. He was deeply embedded in the business side of the sport the entire time, helping run a company while the specific discipline that had made him famous as a competitor kept losing ground beneath him. He was, in a strange way, both an industry insider and a competitive outsider during the exact same stretch of years. The turning point came in 1991 when Mullen joined Plan B Skateboards, a company started by Mike Ternasky. Ternasky saw something in Mullen that Mullen had not fully let himself see yet, that his flat ground technical mastery could be grafted directly onto the ledges, gaps, and handrail street skating was built around, rather than treated as a separate dying discipline. Ternasky pushed him to make the transition, and the results showed up in Plan B's 1992 video, Questionable. In it, Mullen formally crossed over from freestyle to street skating, blending flip tricks with board slides and grinds over real obstacles for the first time, and debuting two entirely new tricks in the process, the Casper slide and the kickflip under flip. It is one of the most influential video parts skateboarding has ever produced, and it happened without a single judge, scorecard, or podium anywhere near it. Skate magazines at the time treated Mullen's shift almost like a changing of the guard, less a comeback than a formal handoff from one era of the sport to the next, delivered by the one person who had actually lived through both of them. Fans who had grown up watching freestyle contests suddenly saw the same hands responsible for 33 championship runs applying that same precision to a ledge instead of an open floor, and the reaction inside the sport was closer to disbelief than nostalgia. Outside the industry, the absence read very differently. Casual fans who only knew Mullen from freestyle contest highlights simply assumed he had faded out of relevance once vert and street took over, the same way plenty of dominant athletes quietly disappear once their specific discipline stops being fashionable. That assumption was almost the exact opposite of what was actually happening. He was not fading. He was rebuilding an entirely new skill set in relative obscurity, refining tricks that would not fully register with the wider sport until video parts caught up to what he had already worked out alone. The mystery around his 90s absence was never really a mystery inside skateboarding itself, but it looked like one from the outside, and that gap between perception and reality is part of why his reemergence hit as hard as it did once people actually saw it. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. By the early 90s, street skating's actual currency of respect was shifting away from contests and toward video parts. A rider's standing in the sport was increasingly measured by what they filmed for a company's video, not by where they placed at an event. Mullen, coming off a decade where his entire identity had been built around contest dominance, was walking into a discipline that had already decided contests were not where reputations got made anymore. Choosing to rebuild his career through video parts rather than chasing a street contest circuit was not a retreat. It was Mullen correctly reading where the sport had already moved, even as he was still relearning how to skate it. Then in 1994, Mike Ternasky was killed in a car crash, and Mullen lost the person most directly responsible for guiding his transition into street skating in the first place. Mullen has described having no real choice but to leave Plan B after Ternasky's death, forced once again to find new footing in a sport he had already had to rebuild his identity inside once already, this time without the mentor who had made the first rebuild possible. Layer these events on top of each other and a clearer picture forms of why Mullen was not showing up at 90s contests the way his peers were. He spent the start of the decade watching his own dominant discipline vanish entirely. He then rebuilt himself under Ternasky specifically through video parts, the new format the sport had already decided mattered more than judge competition. And then, right as that path was working, he lost the person who had built it with him and had to start over again for a third time. None of that has anything to do with talent, motivation, or relevance. It has to do with a competitive structure that kept disappearing out from under him at almost every stage of the decade. It would be inaccurate to frame this period as pure suffering with no forward motion because Mullen kept innovating constantly, even while the ground underneath him kept shifting. Tricks that would define street skating for the next 30 years were being worked out during exactly this stretch, largely without a stage built for them yet. When the wider skateboarding world finally caught up to what he had built later in the decade and into the 2000s, the influence became undeniable to riders who had never once watched him step onto a contest podium throughout the entire 90s. There is something almost inverted about Mullen's career when you lay it out this way. Most athletes peak publicly and then fade from view. Mullen's most publicly visible achievement, that decade of near-perfect freestyle contest results, came first in a discipline that then collapsed entirely. His most influential work, the technical foundation of modern street skating, happened largely outside the contest system altogether, worked out under the weight of a controlling home life, a vanishing sport, and the sudden loss of the one mentor who had helped him find a new place inside it. The trophies came before the influence. The reinvention happened in the gaps between them. Mullen has never framed his own story as one of simple triumph over adversity, and that restraint is part of what makes it worth understanding correctly. He has spoken openly about the psychological cost of growing up the way he did, and about how strange it feels to be credited today as the architect of an entire discipline he rebuilt 3 separate times in a single decade, largely away from the format that had made him famous in the first place. The reason Rodney Mullen was not competing through most of the 90s was never a lack of ability. It was a controlling household, a dying sport, and a mentor's sudden death, each one arriving right as he found solid ground again, and each one pushing the most technically gifted skateboarder of his generation further into the solitary work the rest of skateboarding would spend the next 30 years catching up to.